She was 26 years old, and she had exactly $7 sewn into her boot when she walked down to the public dock at Widow's Bay, Maine, and paid every cent of it for a sunken fishing skiff nobody else in 3 towns would touch. It was her employer, a shipping merchant named Ezra Colquitt, who had dismissed her from her position as his household bookkeeper that same week, claiming her late father's old debts made her presence in his home improper. Though everyone in town understood the real reason had more to do with the set of accounts she had recently questioned. With nothing left but her small savings, a canvas bag of clothes, and a father's memory of boats, she bought the half-sunk skiff moldering at the end of the public pier, its hull green with rot, its ribs cracked. A vessel, the whole waterfront agreed, was fit only to be broken up for kindling. They called her a fool for it, and worse, a fool with nowhere left to turn. But sealed within that ruined hull was something that had waited 17 years to be found, a discovery that would not only save one desperate young woman, but would set right a debt the whole town of Widow's Bay had long since stopped believing could ever be repaid. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Content Ashworth. If you have ever had to start over with almost nothing, tell us in the comments below. Content Ashworth had been born in 1861 in Widow's Bay, a modest fishing and shipbuilding town on the coast of Maine, the only child of a boat builder named Josiah Ashworth and his wife Patience, who kept a small household that smelled always of pine tar and salt air, and who raised their daughter with particular unhurried patience of people whose livelihood depended entirely on tides and weather they could not control. Josiah Ashworth was known throughout the harbor as a craftsman of unusual care, a man who could look a length of white oak and see, before a single cut was made, exactly how it wanted to bend into a hull, and he had a habit, one Content absorbed so completely that it became a part of her own way of seeing the world, of insisting that a boat's soundness was never visible from the outside alone. He would run his hand along a hull's interior ribs, tapping gently, listening for particular resonance that told him whether the wood beneath a coat of paint was sound or secretly rotted through. And he told her more than once, crouched together in the dim hold of some fisherman's boat brought in for repair, that a boat, like a person, could look perfectly presentable on the surface, while hiding neither strength or weakness no eye alone could find, and that only patient hands, willing to search where the light did not easily reach, could tell the difference. Her mother Patience taught her differently, but toward a similar understanding, keeping the family's modest accounts with precision that impressed even the harbor merchants who dealt with her, and teaching Content from an early age that a household's true security lay not in what it displayed, but in what it carefully preserved against hard times, small stores set aside, small debts remembered and honored, a ledger kept honestly even when no one was watching check it. Content grew up moving easily between her father's boatyard, where she learned to read wood and rope and tar-blackened timbers when most girls of her age were never taught to develop, and her mother's kitchen table, where she learned figures and accounts with the same careful attention. It was, in its way, an unusually complete education for a girl in a small Maine fishing town, one that combined a craftsman's patient eye with a bookkeeper's exacting honesty, though Content herself would not fully understand how completely these two inheritances would one day intertwine until many years later, kneeling in the dark hull of a boat that was not her father's own. Widow's Bay in Content's childhood was a town whose fortunes rose and fell with its harbor, its modest shipbuilding trade, and its fishing fleet supporting perhaps 400 families across the surrounding coves, and its social life organized loosely around a handful of prominent families who controlled the wharves, the chandlery, and the small bank that financed most of the town's boats. Chief among these was the Colquitt family, shipping merchants of considerable local standing, whose patriarch in Content's girlhood, a stern and calculating man named Obadiah Colquitt, had built a modest fortune trading fish and lumber along the coast and had, in the process, become the principal creditor to nearly every boat builder and fisherman in the harbor, including, as Content would only later fully understand, her own father. Josiah Ashworth's relationship with Obadiah Colquitt was, throughout Content's childhood, a source of quiet tension in her parents' household, for her father had borrowed against his boatyard some years before Content's birth to weather a difficult winter, and the debt, though steadily paid down over the years, remained a persistent weight on the family's modest security, a fact her mother tracked with grim precision in her careful ledgers. The event that would eventually unravel Content's comfortable childhood arrived in the autumn of 1878. When Content was 17, in the form of a violent early-season storm that swept the Maine coast and claimed, among its losses, a small fishing sloop belonging to a young widow named Sarah Teague and her 3 children, a boat Josiah Ashworth had built himself some years before and had continued, out of quiet personal obligation, to maintain and repair at reduced cost given the family's circumstances. Josiah was aboard the Teague sloop that terrible night, helping Sarah's eldest son secure it against the coming weather when the storm arrived faster than anyone had predicted, and he did not survive the capsizing that followed, leaving Patience and 17-year-old content to face both grief and a boatyard suddenly without its master craftsman. Patience, already in fragile health, followed her husband within 18 months, worn down. Content always privately believed, as much by grief as by any specific ailment, and Content found herself, at 19, entirely alone in the world, the boatyard's remaining debt to Obadiah Colquitt still outstanding, and now entirely her burden to bear. It was in the aftermath of this double loss that Content first came to work in the Colquitt household, an arrangement proposed by Obadiah Colquitt himself of what he framed as generous Christian charity, offering the orphan girl position as his household bookkeeper in exchange for forgiveness of a portion of her father's remaining debt, and offer Content, with no other apparent path forward, felt she had little choice but to accept. She spent 7 years in that household, keeping the Colquitt family's accounts, including, increasingly, the accounts of the shipping business Obadiah's son Ezra had taken over managing as his father's health declined. Work she performed with the same scrupulous honesty her mother had taught her, and it was this very honesty that would ultimately prove her undoing in Ezra Colquitt's household. In the spring of 1887, reviewing the accounts of several fishing families who leased boats and equipment from the Colquitt firm under arrangements, Content had always found troublingly opaque. She discovered discrepancies she could not reconcile. Figures suggesting the Colquitt firm had been systematically overcharging its poorest tenant fishermen for equipment maintenance that, according to the firm's own supplier invoices, had never actually been performed. When she raised the matter privately with Ezra Colquitt, expecting at minimum a reasonable explanation, she was met instead with cold irritation and, within the week, dismissed from her position on the pretext that her late father's old debt made her continued presence in a respectable household improper, a transparent fiction that fooled no one in Widow's Bay who bothered to think about the timing. She was 26 years old, with $7 saved from small mending and copying work taken on the side over the years, a canvas bag of clothes, her mother's account book, and a handful of her father's smaller boat-building tools she had kept from the sale of the yard's equipment years before. Widow's Bay offered her no obvious path forward, its social life still largely controlled by the very family that had just dismissed her under false pretenses, and she understood, walking along the harbor with her small bag on the morning after her dismissal, that whatever future she built now would have to be built entirely on her own resources. It was at the public dock, where she had walked simply to think, that she noticed the old skiff, half sunk at its mooring at the end of the pier, a boat she vaguely remembered her father once mentioning had belonged, many years before, to a reclusive old fisherman named Increase Hartwell, who had died, without heirs sometime in the 60s, its ownership since lapsed into a kind of harbor limbo, claimed by no one, maintained by no one, and left finally to rot at its mooring as the town's harbor master periodically threatened, without ever quite following through, to have it broken up and hauled away. Content stood looking at the ruined hull for a long while, and where any casual observer would have seen only a waterlogged wreck fit for firewood, she found herself, almost against her own better judgment, doing what her father had taught her to do with any boat, reading it. She noted, even from the dock above, that the skiff's upper strakes, though weathered and gray, showed the kind of careful, close-fitted joinery her father had always associated with the very best coastal builders, and that its waterline damage, extensive as it clearly was, appeared confined largely to the lower hull rather than having compromised the vessel's overall frame. She inquired at the harbor master's office and learned that the boat could be claimed for a nominal fee covering the town's accumulated mooring charges, a sum that came, after some negotiation, to exactly $7, the whole of what remained to her. The harbor master himself tried gently to dissuade her, suggesting she was throwing away her last money on a wreck not worth the effort of raising it, and were the purchase moved through Widow's Bay's small waterfront community, with predictable speed and predictable amusement, fishermen remarking within her hearing that Ashworth's girl, turned out by the Colquitts, had gone and spent her last coin on Increase Hartwell's rotten old ghost boat, a jest that followed her for weeks afterward. Content heard all of it and said little in response, understanding, as her mother had once taught her about household accounts kept honestly regardless of who was watching, that other people's opinions of a decision were rarely worth as much as a decision itself. What she found, once she had arranged with a sympathetic boatyard hand to help her haul the skiff onto the shore for proper examination, was a hull in worse condition than Pride would prefer, but sounder, in its essential frame, than the town's mockery had suggested. The waterlogged lower planking would need extensive replacement, but the ribs and keel, once clean to years of accumulated growth and grime, showed the same careful, dense-grained construction her father had always prized, that had been selected and shaped by a builder who understood, as her father had, that a boat's soundness lived first in its bones. She worked from dawn until dusk each day through the early weeks of that summer, first draining and drying the hull, then beginning the careful work of replacing rotted planks with salvaged timber she could afford, using her father's smaller tools with a competence that surprised even herself, muscle memory from childhood afternoons spent at his elbow returning to her hands, as though no years had passed at all. It was on the 11th day of this labor, while she was working to remove a badly rotted section of the skiff's forward flooring near the bow, that her chisel caught not on solid wood, but on something that gave a distinctly hollow, resonant sound, precisely the sort of sound her father had always taught her to listen for. She worked more carefully after that, and within the hour had exposed what she recognized immediately as a false floor, a second layer of planking built beneath the skiff's visible flooring, creating a shallow but deliberate cavity running nearly the length of the forward section, sealed with a care that told her, as clearly as any signature, that whoever had built it had wanted its contents protected from both water and casual discovery alike. Prying up a section of this false floor with trembling hands, she found within the cavity a series of oilcloth-wrapped bundles, remarkably well preserved by the tight, careful construction that had kept the worst of the water out even as the hull above it slowly failed, and beneath the bundles, wedged securely against keel, a small iron-banded chest, locked but not so heavily rusted that it resisted her efforts for long. The oilcloth bundles, when Content finally unwrapped them by lamplight in the small rented room she had taken above the chandlery, proved to be papers, remarkably legible despite their age. And as she began to read, she understood with growing astonishment exactly whose boat she had purchased, and exactly why old Increase Hartwell had died, by all accounts, a bitter and reclusive man estranged from a town that had once, apparently, wronged him grievously. The papers were Hartwell's own careful account of events from the early 1860s, records showing that he had once been among Widow's Bay's most prosperous fishermen, a man who had extended credit and assistance freely to struggling neighbors during hard seasons until a series of bad harvests and a harsh winter had left him, like so many others, dependent on financing from the town's rising merchant family, the Colquitts, specifically from Obadiah Colquitt's own father, a man named Silas Colquitt, who had, according to Hartwell's careful accounting, systematically called in loans across the harbor during a single devastating season, using the resulting foreclosures to acquire, at a fraction of their worth, the mooring rights, equipment, and eventually the very boats of a dozen or more fishing families, including, ultimately, most of Hartwell's own fleet and property. What made Hartwell's account so significant, Content realized as she read further into the night, was not merely its confirmation of a story she had heard only in vague, unverifiable whispers around the harbor, but its specificity. Hartwell had kept detailed records of exactly which families had lost property to Silas Colquitt's foreclosures, exactly what those properties had been worth at the time, and exactly how far below fair value the Colquitt family had acquired them, records he had, apparently compiled over years with a deliberate intention of eventually bringing them before some higher authority, whether a court or simply the judgment of the town itself, before his own increasing isolation and eventual death had left the project unfinished. The iron chest, when Content finally worked its lock free, contained not treasure in any simple sense, but something in its way more valuable. The original mortgage documents and foreclosure paperwork for several of the properties Hartwell's account described, documents that Content understood with a slow, deepening comprehension, the Colquitt family had apparently believed destroyed or lost, since several of the very properties described, including, she realized with jolt, portions of the mooring rights and dock space her own father's boatyard had once occupied, remained under continuous Colquitt control to that very day. Their original acquisition never seriously questioned by a town that had largely forgotten or been encouraged to forget exactly how the Colquitts had first come on so much of the harbor. Content sat with these discoveries for a long while, understanding with mounting gravity precisely what she was holding. Proof, documented with fisherman's stubborn precision, of exactly how the Colquitt family fortune had been built, not through the honest trade the family's public reputation suggested, but through a calculated campaign of predatory foreclosure against neighbors who had trusted them, a campaign whose current beneficiary, Ezra Colquitt, had just dismissed her from his household for daring to question a far smaller and more recent version of the same pattern. She thought her own father's decades of quiet debt to the Colquitt family, debt whose origin she now understood rather differently, and she thought, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, that the ruined skiff everyone in Widow's Bay had mocked her for buying had, in fact, waited nearly 2 decades to deliver exactly the reckoning old Increase Hartwell had died trying to bring about himself. She did not act with haste. She spent the following weeks completing the skiff's most essential repairs, both to protect what she had found and because, she told herself honestly, the boat itself represented real value regardless of what else it had revealed. And she turned Hartwell's documents over with the same patient, methodical care her father had taught her to bring to any careful work. She resolved to verify what she could of Hartwell's account before bringing it forward, understanding correctly that a claim resting solely on one dismissed bookkeeper's discovery would be dismissed by the Colquitt family as fabrication or misunderstanding, however carefully documented. It was an elderly former ship's chandler named Amos Pratt, one of the few surviving residents old enough to remember the foreclosures of the 1860s firsthand, who confirmed the content, once she carefully showed him portions of Hartwell's account, that he remembered clearly the particular winter in question, remembered the sudden calling in of debts across the harbor, and remembered, too, old Increase Hartwell's bitter, largely unheeded complaints in the years that followed, complaints the town had gradually learned to dismiss as the ravings of a man embittered by ordinary bad luck rather than deliberate injury. Word of Content's discovery, inevitably, began moving through Widow's Bay before she felt fully prepared for it. For Amos Pratt, delighted to have his old memories finally taken seriously, mentioned the matter to a neighbor, and within days the story, considerably distorted into rumors of buried pirate treasure, reached Ezra Colquitt himself. He came to the chandlery loft where Content had taken a room, dressed in his fine dark coat, and did not trouble himself with any pretense of courtesy. He told her plainly that whatever old papers a bitter, half-mad fisherman had left behind held no legal standing against decades of established Colquitt ownership, properly recorded at the county registry, and that a young woman already dependent on the goodwill of respectable families would be wise to consider carefully before making trouble that could only end badly for her. Content, who had spent 7 years watching the Colquitt family's version of respectability up close, told him only that she intended to see Increase Hartwell's true account brought before the town, and that he was welcome to contest its accuracy before whoever in Widow's Bay still remembered what honest dealing looked like. It was not an empty response, and Ezra Colquitt seemed to sense it, for within days a notice arrived questioning the legitimacy of Content's claim to the skiff itself, citing an obscure harbor regulation Content strongly suspected had been invented for the occasion, suggesting the vessel had never been properly available for purchase and should revert to town authority pending review. Content understood precisely what pressure was being applied and by whom, and she understood too that she had no money for lawyers and little formal standing in a town where the Colquitt name still carried considerable weight. What she had was Hartwell's meticulous documentation, Amos Pratt's corroborating memory, and a growing certainty, born of her mother's own lessons about honest accounts kept regardless of who was watching, that the only way to protect the truth now was to bring it before people whose authority Ezra Colquitt could not simply overrule. She carried Hartwell's original mortgage and foreclosure documents to the county courthouse in the district seat, where a records clerk, examining the paperwork against the county's own archive registry entries, confirmed with growing interest that the documents appeared to be genuine originals long presumed lost, records whose absence from the official file had, Content now realized, likely been arranged rather than accidental. The clerk referred the matter to a county judge named Judge Ansel Fairweather, a deliberate, unhurried man known throughout the district for his careful attention to old property disputes, who spent the better part of a month cross-referencing Hartwell's documentation against surviving harbor records, tax assessments, and the testimony of several other elderly Widows Bay residents whom Content, with Amos Pratt's help, was able to locate and bring forward. Judge Fairweather's eventual ruling, delivered before a courtroom crowded with more Widows Bay's residents than the building had likely ever held at once, found Hartwell's documentation authentic, and the original foreclosures it described to have involved sufficient irregularity to warrant formal review of several current Colquitt property claims, including the mooring and dock rights that had once belonged to Content's own father, rights the ruling restored in modified form to a trust, benefiting the harbor's working fishing families rather than the Content personally, a resolution she herself had proposed and insisted upon. Content did not seek Ezra Colquitt's complete ruin, and she said as much plainly when he came to find her one final time, considerably diminished in the town's estimation, at the small dock where her restored skiff, its hull now sound and freshly caulked, sat ready for its first proper launch in nearly 2 decades. She told him only that she intended to see the harbor trust properly administered for the benefit of the working families whose grandparents had been wronged, and that whatever remained of the Colquitt family standing in Widows Bay was now a matter between them and a town that had finally learned the true history of how so much of its harbor had changed hands. The trust, established with the support of Judge Fairweather's ruling and funded partly by a court-ordered settlement from the Colquitt estate, went on to provide low-cost mooring and equipment loans to Widows Bay's fishing families for a generation afterward, administered from a small office Content herself oversaw for many years, built, fittingly, from the proceeds of the very skiff that first revealed the injustice it now worked to correct. By the following spring, the boat that Widows Bay had once mocked her for buying sat proudly moored at the public dock, fully restored, its hull sound from keel to gunwale, and the young woman who had raised her from the wreck was no longer spoken of as the Colquitts' dismissed bookkeeper, but sought out by fishing families across the harbor. For fairness, her careful memory for old debts finally set right, and the particular quiet integrity that had once seemed, to a girl kneeling beside her father in some stranger's damp hull, like the only inheritance worth having. A boat's soundness is never visible from the outside alone, he had told her, and only patient hands willing to search where the light does not easily reach can tell the difference between what merely looks broken and what has quietly, all along, been waiting to be found sound. Content Ashworth, standing at last on the deck of a skiff that had kept old Increase Hartwell's unfinished reckoning for nearly 2 decades, understood the full weight of that lesson. She had come to that ruined hull at 26 with $7 and no home, dismissed by the very family whose fortune, she would soon discover, had been built on wrongs like the one just done to her. She left it, not by sailing away, but by becoming, finally, the person who set right what a bitter old fisherman had died unable to finish, a woman who had taken a wreck everyone called worthless and found within it the means to restore not just her own fortunes, but an entire harbor's long-buried sense of what was owed. We hope Content's story reminded you, as it reminded us in the telling, that the things left to rot and forgotten sometimes hold the truth a whole community has been quietly waiting to have restored. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who understands what it means to rebuild from almost nothing, and we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.